Hello, my name's Janice Godrich and I'm the President of PCS, and I'm here at PCS headquarters in Clapham along with Mark Serwotka, our General Secretary, for our third Facebook Live event. The event will last for around 45 minutes and shortly we'll be taking your questions on the budget, on pay and on the civil service compensation scheme. If you'd like to send in questions, please can you give your name and workplace when you do so. And it'd also be great if during the event you could share it and whilst it's happening. Now, before we start on the questions, today is the first day of 2 days industrial action by our members in the DVSA. Mark, you've been doing quite a few press interviews today on this. Would you like to let us know how the action's been going?
Hi, thanks Janice, and good evening everybody. Indeed, we have had extensive media coverage today for a 48-hour strike of our members in the DVSA. It's been an incredibly well-supported strike, and it's been called today because of the introduction of the new driving test that was due to be introduced today. And can I start by saying that our activists and members have done a brilliant job in DVSA. 70% turnout in the industrial action ballot. 84% of members voted to strike, and it's been an incredibly solid strike today. Over 10,000 driving tests that were due to take place have had to be cancelled. We have two concerns in this dispute. One is over the safety of the new test that's been introduced, and we're calling for that to be independently looked at by the Health and Safety Executive. But equally importantly, because of attacks on our members' terms and conditions, about where our members can be deployed to work from, whether they have insurance cover in their travel from home to their workplace, and indeed whether they even get paid. And it could well be the case that a management could be asking our members to work up to 90 minutes a day unpaid from what they currently do. So it's a very important dispute. A lot of media coverage, very well supported, and I'd urge anyone who's watching tonight to send messages of support to our members in DVSA. Have a look to see if there's a picket line that you could attend tomorrow and give full support, because if we can make progress in this dispute, it'll be good news for all PCS members and particularly for those working in the DVSA.
Thanks, Mark. Certainly echo that request, and on behalf of everyone here and everyone watching, I'm sure everyone sends their solidarity to those members, and there's details on our website about how you can show that practical support. Turning to our questions, our National Executive Committee meets from tomorrow here in Clapham and clearly needs to take decisions on how to take forward our big national campaigns. And one of the main issues that will shape how we do that is the recent budget. Mark, it's now been a week since the budget. Can you tell us what the key issues that raised for PCS members?
Yeah, thanks Janice. And I'm glad we had quite a few questions in around the budget. We went on record on the day of the budget as saying it was the most underwhelming and disappointing budget in recent memory. All the mood music in the run-up was that the government was going to make concessions on the question of public sector pay, and that was the thing I think everybody looked for. And of course, the budget disappointed absolutely in the terms of public sector pay. But what we've done this year is something different. We've commissioned some independent research from the Centre for Labour and Social Studies, a very well-respected independent think tank, and they've done a lot of number crunching on the budget. And I'll be producing a report for the NEC tomorrow, Janice, so hopefully we'll be able to publish to branches in due course. And maybe it's worth just giving some of the headlines, because if the key for PCS members here was the question of public sector pay, people will remember that we had three demands: scrap the pay cap for everyone, put funding in from the budget to allow above inflation pay rises. And our detailed independent analysis of the budget itself is really bad news for PCS members and their families, because what the budget has confirmed is that the cuts the government is making to departmental budgets, those parts that are used for employment costs, pay and pensions, we are seeing further swinging cuts. So let me give you two examples. DWP. The budget confirmed that over the next 3 years, the budgets of which pay derive from will reduce by 15.29%. In HMRC, those budget reductions will be 13.55%. In the Home Office, those budgets will reduce by 1.82%. Now this is significant because it's further cuts in budgets. But what's really worrying about these figures is in order to fund a 1% pay claim, just a 1% pay claim, what the government needed to do in DWP was to increase the budget by 15%, in HMRC by 14%. This is just for a 1% pay rise. If we got a 5% pay rise, which is what we think we needed, DWP would need an increase of 20% on the relevant budgets. They're actually getting a cut of 15%. Now, why this is incredibly significant and why we've done this analysis is that what this tells us is under the current budget reductions that this budget has confirmed, it means that departments cannot even give a 1% pay rise without further cuts in budgets that they are already reducing significantly. And that brings very sharply into focus the Chancellor has totally failed to put money into the public sector and the civil and public service that we depend on in order to alleviate the pay crisis. That is the big story from the budget for us. He ignored our demands, he ignored our members' views in the ballot, and he has not put money in. He has cut the budgets even further, and that's what we're going to have to campaign around in the next weeks and months.
And what does that budget analysis tell us about the level of cuts from departmental budgets? Has austerity ended, for example?
Well, it means austerity is not only continuing, but it's going to continue in quite a severe way. So again, to give you some comparative figures, what we've seen in DWP is that between 2012 and 2017, the budgets were reduced by 20%. This budget confirms in the next 3 years there will be a further 15% reduction. So what that's essentially telling us is the rate of cuts is staying steady. It's not stopped. It's not slowed down. It is very much on a continuing downward spiral. And that is if we didn't have a pay rise. The pay rises that we want would have to come out of these shrinking budgets, which would exacerbate the situation even more. And put crudely, it means if we want a pay rise, then public services our members deliver and the amount of jobs that we have in these departments will go down in a dramatic way, and that's what we have to say is completely unacceptable. And all our campaigning now, I think, has to bear that in mind. Without money being put in by the government, there will be further cuts and there will not be adequate pay rises.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So we can take it from that the government hasn't ended the pay cap.
Indeed, they haven't. They say there is now no pay cap, but actually what they've done is to say there's no pay cap, but we're cutting the budgets even further, and you cannot even have a 1% pay rise without those cuts being even deeper and even more painful. So if I was going to sum that up, you would say that we emailed the Chancellor, we had a record ballot result. Did he listen? Absolutely no, he didn't listen. He has stuck the proverbial 2 fingers up to PCS members and their families and said more of the same, and that is what we cannot allow to stand. Okay,
thanks, Mark. Both you and I have recently, along with colleagues, been involved in some talks around the compensation scheme. Would you like to say a bit about those talks and where are we with those?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. Again, against this background of a difficult financial situation, we've now had 4 meetings with the employer over the question of our redundancy arrangements. And I'm very pleased to report that we're in talks with unions who agree with PCS. So we're in talks with Unite, the POA and the GMB, representing the overwhelming majority of trade unionists in the civil service. And our position is there should be no changes now to the 2010 compensation scheme. And our absolute red line is that in trying to defend those terms, we will not accept an agreement that is not an improvement on what the government imposed in 2016. And we've spelt that out in great detail to the employer. And we're now at the stage where post-budget, we're doing a lot of number crunching, that we've asked for a lot of information from the management side about their financial projections, what the cost envelope for these talks is, and what the government have told them they've got to deliver. And on that basis, we're continuing to engage now. We have meetings for negotiations throughout December, right towards the end of January and into February. And our commitment is that we are standing up for our members to defend their redundancy rights. We are in those negotiations with unions who are absolutely with us, with the same demands in unity, and we will carry on reporting the outcome of those negotiations after every meeting as we've done up to now.
Thanks, Mark. Just on that subject, we've got a question from John, who works in HMRC, and he asks, HMRC announced the Building Our Future campaign in November 2015. how is it right to change the CSCS terms after such a major announcement with 6,000 to 10,000 redundancies expected?
Well, it's a great question, and of course the answer is it can't be right. It is the most shameful way to treat dedicated staff in HMRC who, despite staffing reductions of up to 50,000 in recent years and office closures, continue to try to deliver first-class services in a very difficult situation. And what the government and HMRC management are really saying to our members in HMRC is that not only are we going to close the offices and make the redundancies, we actually want to do it with you getting less money. And HMRC are one of the departments who are pressuring the Cabinet Office, we believe, to get on with the negotiations to make cuts in terms. And we have said to the Cabinet Office, and I'm glad to say that they have confirmed, that until our negotiations are complete at the centre, 2010 terms apply to everybody, and that occurs in HMRC as well as anybody else. So our message, I think, to our members there is with the group executive and with our activists, is we should be fighting the office closures, we should be doing all we can to prevent the redundancies, but crucially, if people are leaving the civil service, they should not be going on the cheap, and that is why the redundancy negotiations are so important, and the union remains strong in HMRC and right across the board.
Thanks, Mark. Just following on from that, we've got a question from Kevin, who asks, why does it appear that Prospect and the FDA continue to undermine the efforts of PCS, Unite, the GMB and the POA to defend our redundancy scheme, which enables the Tories to drive a wedge between the civil service unions?
Well, that's another great question, and it's a great question because my guess is that the workplace that this question has come from, if there are Prospect and FDA members in that workplace, they will be scratching their heads as much as we are, as to probably ask, why can't the unions all be in the same room negotiating on behalf of the management? It's what we wanted. We invited all the unions, including Prospect and the FDA, to have a common negotiating front. And unfortunately, because the FDA and Prospect had already made it public that their aim was only to try to restore the 2016 terms, of course, that our members rejected by over 90% in a ballot, meant it was impossible to have a common negotiating position. And that is why, in the end, the unity that we have achieved is with the 4 unions representing the majority, overwhelming majority, we all have the same position. And even though it's unfortunate there isn't one set of talks, I hope that people may agree with us. It's better to be in talks with people you can rely on, that will have a united position from start to end representing the majority, than actually be at the table with unions who've already indicated that they are trying to achieve something that we have already rejected and got overturned in the court. So that's why we are where we are. But my plea to all members of unions in the civil service is to say that these redundancy rights that were imposed by the government in 2016 were not good enough. They weren't good enough then, they're not good enough now. Join us in campaigning to defend the terms as best as we can.
Thanks, Mark. And finally, just on the CSCS, Tom asks, do we know how long the CSCS terms will take to be agreed?
No, we don't, Tom. And in many senses, I think our view is it's better to take a long time to get a decent agreement than to rush and get a poor one. The security we've got here, Tom, is that the existing 2010 terms remain in place until either we've reached an agreement or it is judged by the government that we're not likely to reach an agreement. And in that sense, it'll take as long as it takes. But I hope that we can all agree that the protection we've secured through our legal victory means however long it takes, people get better terms at the moment than they had previously, and that's a good thing.
Absolutely. Turning to pay, it's now a couple of weeks since we closed our recent consultative pay ballot. I'd like, and I suspect Mark will as well, to place on record our thanks to everyone who participated in us achieving that result. What are your reflections on that excellent result?
Well, first of all, I agree with you completely. I mean, this was the union at its best. We have dumbfounded all the critics and people who told us you can't get anywhere near a 50% turnout, there isn't a mood amongst members to do something. And by working together as a team, from every office, members, reps, GECs, the national union leadership, our staff, we have delivered a record result. A turnout that is within a whisker of a 50%, 99% of members rejecting the government's pay policy, and 80% saying they're prepared to go on strike. And we should reflect for a moment, I think, and say that is an extraordinary effort that we have pulled off, and all of us should be really proud of the role that we played. Now, where we go now is this. We're still waiting for a detailed breakdown of the analysis of the ballot that the NEC and the National Disputes Committee will need to consider. The NEC is meeting for the next 48 hours and it's going to discuss the question on pay. And I myself today have attended a meeting with other TUC unions to discuss this question. So I think the immediate future is we have a discussion tomorrow. We've got to carry on recruiting and building the union in every workplace, carry on putting pressure to the government into the new year when the civil service pay remit talks will begin, and when we expect to hear back from other TUC unions in early February whether there is a mood for a common demand and a common campaign across the public sector. And I think what we can say with certainty is PCS members are giving us a mandate to fight for better pay, and what we now need to do with that mandate is use it to pressure the government, try and get unity with other unions, but to build the union and be ballot ready in the question that we have to move to a statutory ballot, that we can win it with a 50% majority and be confident that we can win the dispute. So that's the situation at the moment, and I do hope that people don't just rest on our laurels with the result we've achieved, but continue to recruit new members to the union, get new activists and new advocates, so that if a ballot does be required in the new year, as it probably will be, that we can be confident that we can win it and actually win a pay campaign.
Thanks, Mark. Have you any feedback at the moment on the position of other public sector unions and how likely it is that we're able to join up with them?
Well, I think it's clear that everybody was looking to see our result. And I think our result has been universally accepted across the movement as a fantastic result for a public sector-wide ballot. We've offered everybody to come and talk to us about how we achieved that result, what type of things that we did to try to help people. And I'm glad to say that some major unions in this country have already said to us they'd like to come and talk to us about the lessons that we have learnt. So my reading at the moment is there is an appetite for people to stick together over pay, but other unions are now having to have that discussion that we had ourselves about whether they think they can be ballot ready and actually win. And I don't think we'll be really clear about that until some months into the new year. And I think therefore the key for us is to be preparing ourselves for whatever we need to do, whether that's just PCS, whether that's with some unions or whether it's with all TUC unions. Keep working at every level and then let's do what is required next year. So let's keep our fingers crossed, but do more than that. If you are in the union, whether you're a member watching this or whether you are a rep, you're bound to know people in other public sector unions. You may go to meetings with them. You may have friends in other unions. Talk to them about what we're doing, because the more members in other unions who see what we've done and say, do you know what, my pay in local government is terrible, or in the health service, and they start raising it within their own branches, the more chance we've got of getting unity across the top of all the unions.
Thanks, Mark. We've got quite a few questions coming in on pay, and we'll try and deal with them all. I'm just going to take a question from Brian, who works in the border force in Belfast. And, excuse me, he asks, if there is currently no pay progression, why are civil service jobs advertised with a minimum and maximum pay scales? And what steps will PCS take to get pay progression reinstated? And that's an issue that's also been raised by at least 3 other members via email.
Right, well, these are excellent questions. And, of course, the question of pay progression is particularly important if we're not getting any cost of living pay rises. But clearly, if we got cost of living pay rises and we could get everybody to the top of the scale early on, that is the best way to progress for all of us. In the civil service, we have a double whammy. We've had pay restraint and no proper cost of living pay rises, and we've had the end of pay progression, and that has not happened in other parts of the public sector. So we are very conscious about this point. I think what it comes back to is that we need funding in these departments to have these discussions so that we can be deciding in the different bits of the civil service the best way to develop pay systems, as we would like to move to some national system that covered all civil servants in the same way. So rest assured, at every meeting we have, whether it's with the Chancellor or with the Cabinet Office staff and senior management, we make the point that we don't just get 1% pay rises, we actually don't get any pay progression at all, and that is totally and utterly unfair and must be resolved. So it is very much at the forefront of our negotiators' minds moving forward.
Thanks, Mark. We've had a couple of questions about the hypocrisy of MPs receiving pay rises of in excess of 15% when public sector workers are subject to pay freeze and pay cap. And alongside that, an interesting question from Yvonne, who asks about how do we address the risk of public hostility to our pay campaign. The government are taking advantage of the public's lack of understanding of the pay freeze. So some questions there about public perception and the hypocrisy of MPs awarding themselves pay rises when we're subject to this pay cap.
Okay, thanks for that, Yvonne. Another great question. On the hypocrisy of MPs, look, I mean, I tend to take the view that for us, you know, if anything, we should say if it's good enough for MPs, it's good enough for us, and let's all level up to the same type of pay rises as they're getting. I think it is clear that we do have a substantive amount of support now amongst parliamentarians across many political parties that the public sector pay cap should not just be ended, but there needs to be funded. But the point is very well made, and if it's good enough for elected representatives in Parliament, it should be good enough for people who pay the benefits, collect the tax, do the driving tests and keep this country secure in its borders. On the question of public perception, Yvonne, though, perhaps I've got a bit better news for you, because we've long felt, I think, that we haven't had public support and that people perhaps don't know what we do and whether we deserve pay rises. All recent polling tell us that's changed. The TUC has just published evidence from polling that actually says 70% of the public now support proper pay rises for all public sector workers, and that the pay cap is unfair. And that is a real seismic shift from where we used to get in the past. And actually, I think it's, to my mind, we can be very confident that were we, for example, now to have a campaign including industrial action, we would get very large levels of public support, because I think they recognise that what's happening to millions of public servants is happening to people on benefits, is happening to people whose services are being reduced. I think people have got the fact that austerity is doing down the majority of this country, and public sector pay is a part of that. So I think we will get a lot of public support, and we'll certainly do all we can to make sure that's delivered in the event that there's any campaign and any action in the future.
A couple of questions about industrial action, which we can take together. John asks, do you agree that the government's protracted Brexit negotiation difficulties make it more likely that they would not like to have to confront the civil service-wide industrial action at the same time? And alongside that, Jim has asked that whilst we had the largest turnout in a ballot for a long time, it still wouldn't be enough to meet the requirement under new legislation to allow us to take action. And how do you see PCS being able to achieve their aims in order to reach that threshold?
Okay. So on Brexit, let's be clear, the government's a shambles. Arguably, it is so weak and so shambolic that the question is absolutely right, that if we were now, and particularly if other public sector unions joined us, put up a major fight on pay, I think we can win. And I think we can win because it's not a government that is able, against public opinion, against the public sector workforce standing together, to be able to withstand what are very reasonable and justifiable demands. So yes, I think we should maximise now the leverage that we have, which is why we are certainly, on the back of our ballot result, urging other public sector unions to come to this conclusion early in the new year so that we can actually seize the moment. On the question about the ballot threshold, look, I start from this position, which is this wasn't just a very good result in overall terms. For this union, it broke new ground. I mean, the only ballot result that ever came close to this was a 42% turnout, and that was back in 2004. And every turnout after that was slightly lower. So this has broken new ground. We've used new methods in order to deliver it, new organising techniques, use of technology, lots of face-to-face discussions. We've recruited 3,000 members doing the pay ballot. So it's a success story for the union. But Roy is right to say if that was the statutory ballot result, it would be the ridiculous situation where you've got a 49% turnout, 99% vote on one question, 80% on another, and it still wouldn't be a lawful strike. It sort of highlights how outrageous the law is, but it still tells us we've got a little bit of work to do. And what I would like to assure Roy and others is because of the way we've done the ballot and the detailed analysis now that the Disputes Committee and the NEC will be able to think through, I'm very confident that because we will see where we did really well and where we need perhaps to put more support in, with a targeted push, we can definitely be confident that we can break 50% if a real ballot is required. And I think that's why this whole exercise has been so positive for us all.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Turning to a question from one of our Scottish members, Wendy. Wendy asks about public sector pay in Scotland. It seems that in Scotland, she says, the Scottish Government have pledged to give civil servants a pay rise and to scrap the cap. And she's asking, is this correct?
Well, we'll know soon, won't we? Because I think the Scottish Government budget is later this month. And we will then see whether all the claims from the Scottish Government that they are against austerity and will break the pay cap will be true or not. I very much hope that the Scottish Government shows Theresa May what she should be doing and says we have scrapped the cap, we are putting money in that can deliver above inflation pay rises for PCS members and other public sector workers in Scotland. That's what I hope to see. Is that what I expect? Well, let's wait and see. I don't think we think that's the mood music coming from the Scottish Government. But I can assure people if that is what happens, we will use that as a good example that the UK Government should follow. If it doesn't happen, be in no doubt in Scotland as well as everybody else, we will say whether it's the SNP or whether it's the Tories in Westminster, you cannot just say you're against the pay cap if you don't put the money in that is required to deliver above inflation pay rise. And I think it is worth remembering in Scotland and in the UK that inflation is higher than it has been for years. The CPI is still at 3%. The retail price index, which is the one we all used to use, is nearly 4%. And so unless we get pay rises that are above 3% or 4% arguably, it will be another year of a cut in your living standards. So let's hope the Scottish Government do something about that later this month, and let's hope the UK Government can be forced to do what they didn't do in last month's budget. Thanks,
Mark. Just to remind people, we're at our Facebook Live event at PCS. We've got about 10-12 minutes left of the event tonight. It's great to see people commenting on the Facebook event as it's going on. We've even had some comments from people who said that it's great and that they're inspired to become a rep because of the way that they see it, and I think that's really excellent. So continue to send your comments in. We've had a lot of questions. We can't deal with all of them, but we will try and endeavour to get answers to people who we can't answer on the Facebook Live event over the next few days. We've got a question from Sue, and Sue's asked, what's the position of the current opposition parties in relation to the pay cap?
Okay, thanks very much, Sue. We've had large levels of support. We just talked about the SNP, who say they are against the pay cap, and we're hoping that they demonstrate that in real terms in the budget. The Labour opposition have told us very clearly they believe the cap should be scrapped and funding should be put in. And therefore, we would expect that as our campaign continues, we will get a large degree of support from the official opposition. And as an aside, I should say that, today, with our strike in the DVSA, we've had messages of support from Chris Stevens, the chair of our parliamentary group, and from the Labour front bench. And indeed, the Labour Shadow Transport Secretary has written to Chris Grayling demanding that he does something about the dispute. So I think we'll get large levels of support. And certainly those politicians, and I would say here that particularly in Westminster, Jeremy Corbyn has made it clear that the Labour Party, in opposition as the main opposition party, demands a scrapping of the cap and funding to be put in. And therefore, again, I would be confident that if we move to an industrial action ballot in the new year, we'll get large levels of political support from Labour, from Plaid Cymru, from the Greens, and from the SNP, and we just hope that that support is shown not just nationally, but also that those parties use their influence where they can to do something where they have politicians in power to actually sort of not just talk the talk but walk the walk as well.
Thanks, Mark. We've seen recently the union has supported a number of disputes about the threats of closures of offices up and down the country. What do you think lies behind the government's policy in terms of the amount of office closures that it's proposing, not just in, say, DWP, but in the rest of the public sector as well?
I mean, that's another great question, and I think we would both want to say, wouldn't we, that we've had disputes against office closures. We've had them in a number of areas. I would particularly want to mention the Eastern Avenue strike in Sheffield, where our members had weeks of strike action to try and keep that office open in a very brave dispute. And we've also had other members in Plymouth recently in DWP, and before that quite a number of other DWP offices. What drives the government is saving money. I mean, it really does highlight their claim to want decent public services is hypocrisy, because you can't have decent public services if you withdraw public service delivery from the parts of the country that desperately need them. They want to save money, they want to close buildings down to stop paying rents, they want to sell some of them off. They see it as a way of actually saving millions and millions of pounds. And our starting point is the complete opposite, of course. We think that if it costs money to deliver proper public services, it's money well spent. And therefore it's not only bad for the public. I think we would also want to make this point, wouldn't we, that we joined the civil service, Janice. I don't know if we can reveal this, but in the early 1980s. And when we joined the civil service, it was on the background that there had been a political consensus in this country, going back to the 1950s, that governments of various colours and shades used the civil service and the public sector to create jobs in parts of Britain that the market would never deliver those jobs. So we're talking here in the North East, in Scotland, in South Wales, in Devon and in Cornwall. Those parts of the country where the public sector was your route in to a job with training, to the potential for career development and a pension. And it is withdrawing from those communities. You know, we've spoken to members, haven't we, who have been in the civil service for 20 or 30 years, who are now having to leave because they are better off getting a minimum wage job in their town rather than have to travel 40 miles to work, for goodness sake. So the government want to save money. We want decent jobs for our members and for their children in generations to come, and we want to give decent services to people, whether it's in Stockton, whether it is in Falkirk or whether it is in Truro. And at the moment we are poles apart from the government, and that is why local campaigning with the communities, up to and including not just political but industrial opposition, is vital, because every office we can save is a job for people in the future, and it is somewhere the public can go for us to help them.
Thanks, Mark. Coming to the final 5 minutes of the Facebook Live event now, I'm going to try and get in the questions that we've got, but as I said earlier, we will aim to answer those questions that we can't cover tonight. Interesting question from Bob. In the light of the revelations contained in the Paradise Papers, what does this say politically about the commitment of this government to end tax evasion and tax avoidance when cutting thousands of jobs in HMRC?
So the short answer is it tells us everything we need to know. It's a government that wants to cut jobs and look the other way when rich people and corporations are spiriting away their money rather than fund the public services in Britain. That's the truth. And it really highlights the government's priorities are not the priorities of not just our members, but the overwhelming bulk of people in this country. And I think that the work we've done on tax justice with the HMRC group and campaigning on tax justice with others has been groundbreaking, because, you know, we've taken the dry issue of tax that doesn't exactly get people's pulses racing, and we've been able to explain why if you don't get the tax in, you can't fund the public services, the schools, the hospitals, the benefits that people require, and that actually we don't get the tax in because we haven't got enough staff to collect them, but also we don't have the laws tight enough to stop people avoiding and evading tax. And that's what's quite exciting about the work that we've done, because the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, who we've worked with on this subject for over a decade, is very clear that if he becomes the Chancellor rather than the Shadow Chancellor, he will legislate and he will put thousands of jobs back into HMRC to chase down this tax gap of tens of billions of pounds. And just imagine what we would do with that. It wouldn't just mean jobs in HMRC and jobs for future generations, but it would actually mean we'd have the money in that could pay for the pay rises and for the better benefit system and for better public services. It's a win-win. But the Tories are not interested in a win-win. What they want is to cut jobs, save money on the back of what people really need, while letting rich people off the hook.
Absolutely, and that's why our campaign for an alternative is incredibly important. Just on that subject, we've had a question about universal credit. Many families and communities are facing a difficult time over the next few weeks. What is PCS's position on universal credit, and what can we do in order to show that that policy isn't working?
Well, obviously, Janice, you work yourself in the DWP, and you'll have first-hand experience of working with people in an office and knowing the reps to understand what a problem this is. What I would say for PCS nationally is that we have long recognised the problems with universal credit, and we have long recognised the fact that this rollout should be stopped so that we can get to grips with the real difficulties of the benefit that has been designed with so many problems and has been designed and implemented against a department where there are staff shortages and where we actually have got a lot of work to do to provide proper services. So our call, supported by many political parties, is to stop the rollout and to start getting to grips with the real problems about the delays in benefit, the way that benefit is paid, what effect that has on knock-on benefits, and whether in fact we have the resources available to deliver the service that people desperately need. The government made some concessions in the budget, but I think our assessment of that, it was sort of tinkering, really. They were cosmetic. Of course, we welcome the fact that they stopped the 7 waiting days and the fact that they say that they will make it easier now for people to get a sort of advance payment. But in reality, we know far more is needed than that tinkering. And I think anybody who had any humanity about them would listen to the charities, listen to the workers in DWP, and listen, most importantly, to the people who are suffering, people who have been evicted from their houses by some landlords around this country, and say, if we are going to let this stand, it tells us a lot about where the government is. And given our last question, what a contrast between tax avoidance and tax evasion and benefits. You couldn't have a better way of describing where the government's priorities are. So I'm very proud of the role that our members have played in DWP and our reps and the GEC, and I hope we can all agree here that we need a proper conversation about the type of benefit system this country deserves. That's our policy in our union, to devise a better benefit system moving forward. But in the short term, stop the rollout, address the problems properly, and give us the resources we need to do the job.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to take a final question now, and in doing so ask you to maybe in your closing message to say what we'd like members to consider doing on the issue of pay in the immediate future. But there's a question from Craig, who's writing on behalf of Stockton and Tame Valley branch, and he asks, will the analysis and results of the consultative ballot be circulated to branch level in order to help with continued organising?
Okay, so I'll deal with that question.
Yep.
So thanks very much for that. Look, what we did the ballot this way so that we could learn where our strengths are, where we need to do more work to support people on the ground. We haven't got this back yet, and we need to look at that in great detail. So what's going to happen first is the Disputes Committee will analyse the lot, and we'll have a discussion with the NEC. And we need to walk this tightrope where we want branches to have the information how they themselves have done in order that they can indeed work with us to try and build the union participation and membership levels. But of course what we don't want to do is inadvertently put information in the public domain that the employer has access to, because we're very nervous, and we have good reason. HMRC, when it tried to essentially bust the union a number of years back, we found a leaked document, and it said their strategy to break PCS would start in the areas that they saw the union was weakest. And if you know that's the mentality of the employer, what would be a disaster is if they got hold of information that meant they would be examining where they thought we were strong and weak. So we do want branches to work and have the understanding of how they've done, but what we don't want is a big public airing of all the many thousands of our workplaces that the employer will use for purposes that won't be helpful. And that's what we just need to talk about. Yeah. But I think our commitment, Janice, is we want to work with branches to ensure that we can deliver even better votes and better participation moving forward.
Thanks, Mark. Well, that brings us, I think, to the end of our time on this Facebook Live event. And can I thank everyone who's helped make this event happen tonight? It's certainly something that we intend to continue doing, and hopefully on different subjects as we go on. So thank you all for participating. Continue to share it, and hopefully we'll be able to update you on all the issues that we've discussed tonight following the meeting of the National Executive Committee this week. And on behalf of Mark and myself and the NEC, can I wish you all the best over the festive season, and I hope that whatever happens, you're able to spend some relaxing time with family and friends, and also come back refreshed for the battles that we need to face in the new year. Thank you.